All right, our first guest out of the hopper here, dealing with the big news of the National Hockey League right now. And it's news that I'm sure the Oilers didn't think they would be making, as two of their valued players get offer sheeted by the St. Louis Blues. From Oilers Nation, Tyler Yaremchuk joins us here on Sikaris and Price. Tyler, how are you, sir?
I am doing good, boys. Hope your summer's going well.
Yeah, and it was going well, I'm sure, for the Edmonton Oilers. They made all sorts of good news in free agency. They'd, ticked a lot of boxes, and then kaboom, the Blues come calling. How did this news go down this week here at Edmonton with the possible losses of a couple of big players?
Yeah, well, it didn't go over all that great. You have a fan base, and I mean, some fans are angry at the players for taking the offer sheets. They're angry at the Blues for being this aggressive with the offer sheets. They're angry at the Oilers for not signing these two guys earlier. So there's a lot of fingers being pointed everywhere. Whose fault is this? And it caught a lot of us by surprise. When we kind of were breaking down the Oilers cap situation over the last number of weeks, it was like, okay, the Kane LTIR stuff was starting to bubble up, and it was you have Holloway and Broberg. Neither of them have arbitration rights. And it was like, okay, most of the time in these situations, they let it play out into September, and then the team kind of squeezes the player down to more or less whatever number they want to. And we said the only kind of leverage that Broberg and Holloway have is to sign an offer sheet. And then it was like, well, no one ever signs offer sheets. So what do the Oilers have to worry about? And then lo and behold, an offer sheet comes through, and it's a pretty tough one to match. Like, the Blues obviously knew what they were doing in all of this, and now the Oilers are in a real pinch.
Fans hate to get mad at players, guys, but it is unbelievable that doesn't happen more. It is the player that signs the offer sheet. They are involved in this process, and they often get absolved of any sort of finger pointing. It always just kind of lays down at the feet of the team.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, I'm not going to be one to blame Philip Broberg specifically in all of this, because it's like, okay, you played 10 good games in the playoffs. Outside of that, you've never really been a regular NHL defenseman, and you've turned those 10 good games into $9 million guaranteed over the last 2 years, and business is business. If Broberg would have came onto the Oilers last year at a $900,000 contract and blown out his knee in November and been out for 6 months, the Oilers wouldn't have been like, you know what, we feel bad for you. Here's a couple $1,000,000. Like, he would have just been hooped. And this is his one career, his one chance to go out and make money. The one that honestly was a bit more surprising to me was Dylan Holloway, just because, again, the Oilers would have given him around $1,000,000 next year. And they would have said, here's a spot in the top 9. Here's potentially a spot next to Leon Draisaitl. Go out, have a big year, and who knows, if you pop 20 goals, you could be making a lot more money in Edmonton than you could be somewhere else, because of the opportunity that comes playing with McDavid and Draisaitl. Going to St. Louis, again, yeah, okay, he got a couple extra $1,000,000 guaranteed. That's not insignificant. I'm not trying to downplay that. Like, go get your money. But there's a part of me that's like, okay, you're a young guy in your career. You're a first-round pick. Do you really want to give up the opportunity to play with a Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid to go play with Alexei Torpchenko on the Blues third line? Like, I don't think your chance to make long-term career earnings is as great in St. Louis as it might be in Edmonton.
You touched on it briefly just off the top there, but there is this sense of, hey, why didn't the Oilers just take care of their business sooner and none of this would have happened? Now, it's been an interesting offseason. Obviously, they played deep into June, followed with the draft, and then the transition from Kenny Holland to Stan Bowman. People were already skeptical about Stan Bowman getting back in the National Hockey League. Is there an element that this somehow just kind of fell through the cracks, or is that too simple, and that, even in a transition period, you got to be on top of your business matters when you're running an NHL team?
So I think the big mistake was not trying to get something done during the season with these two and trying to lock in some amount of cost certainty before the free agency period opened. Because, yeah, now you're sitting there kicking yourself going, okay, we love the Jeff Skinner signing. We love the Victor Arvidsson signing. Okay, maybe you didn't need both of those guys. Maybe your forward group was good enough as is that you didn't need to overspend in that area. And now you're at risk of losing two pretty good young players. So I think the mistake was not signing them during the season. As for not signing them in the summer, I mean, by making the decision to let it get to the summer, you've kind of made your bed to an extent that, yeah, you're going to squeeze them for every possible penny. I think the talk was Broberg wanted something around 1.8, Holloway wanted something around 1.2, and it just didn't get done because, again, the Oilers couldn't really afford that. By the time they'd spent their money in free agency, it was like, okay, you're going to let this get to September. You're going to cross your fingers and hope they don't sign an offer sheet somewhere. And then come September 15th, when camp opens up and those guys get the itch, you go, okay. And they did it with Ryan McLeod a couple of years ago too. He ended up signing after scoring like 12 or 13 goals the year before. He ended up signing for $781,000. It was like right on the line of what they needed him to be at. So I think the Oilers just kind of thought their plan of waiting, hoping for no offer sheet, getting to September, and then getting those guys on dirt cheap deals because they have no leverage. I think they thought it would work out. And honestly, like, I don't even really blame them for that, because again, we've seen 2 offer sheets in the last 10 years of the NHL. Like, the idea that some team was going to come at you in this exact predatory fashion, it was a tad unrealistic to think that someone was actually going to have the kahunas to do it.
Now, I know the Oilers have through the weekend to make their decision, and probably will take this thing right down to the wire. I also have seen an awful lot of noise coming out of Edmonton and around the National Hockey League. You mentioned Evander Kane. He could go on LTIR. Like, there are some ways to come at this, and one of them is, oh, well, maybe they could move Cody Ceci and free up that space in the final year. I think it's 3 1/4 for Cody Ceci. In late August, is there a market for Cody Ceci around the National Hockey League, or would the Oilers have to pay to get off that contract?
Maybe a week ago they wouldn't have. And it certainly sounds like, listening to different insiders and things like that, that if they wanted to move Cody Ceci earlier in the summer, there was a market for him and they could have done it. The old saying that our pal Frank likes to throw out is, if you're a GM and you're drowning, the other GMs don't throw you a life raft, they throw you an anvil. And right now, I don't think if there was a GM, whether it's San Jose, Anaheim, whatever team was willing to step up and trade for Cody Ceci, if before they were saying, hey, we'll give you a 4th round pick for him, the tables might be turned now. It might be like, oh, no. You're going to give us a 4th round pick and we'll take Cody Ceci off your hands. So I think they'll have to pay to get off him. And that's another thing that now goes into the equation of all of this. Is like, okay, if you don't match Broberg, you're getting a 2nd round pick. If you don't match Holloway, you're getting a 3rd round pick. If you now all of a sudden have to match, or you want to, I should say, match on both those guys, but then you have to give up a 4th or a 5th round pick to get out of Cody Ceci, it's kind of like you start doing the math of, okay, they're both going to be overpaid on these next deals. Like, Philip Broberg is nowhere near worth $4.5 million, and he's going to have to be paid $4.5 million for 2 years. And then to qualify him when he's still in RFA the 3rd and 4th years, he's going to have to be a $5 million defenseman for you. So it's like, okay, instead of getting the 2nd and the 3rd, you can keep the young players. Then you got to pay to get out of CC, and you have these 2 big contracts on your books, and you have all these sort of different factors that come in. And like, it's going to take the Oilers 6 days to sort out what they want to do here, because there's so many different factors at play.
There's a lot of math here, and it's really hard. Do you buy that Doug Armstrong made the 2 offers with the intention of really only getting one of them? Like, does he have to overwhelm the Oilers with all of these decisions, with all this math, in order to extract one of them? And, I don't know if he's trying to angle them towards one guy or the other. Most people think they match Holloway. Maybe they give up on Broberg. But was this strategy from Doug Armstrong, do you think?
It was great because of the exact dollar amounts and the way things played in. And I do think it's an angle to get Philip Broberg. When you look at the Blues, everything we heard reported about them heading into the summer is they were trying to mix up their blue line. Frank had said, all 3 of Parayko, Leddy, Krug, those guys were on the trading block. Now Krug, I know, is done for the year. He's got that long-term injury thing, and that obviously opens up some money. So you kind of look at the Blues plan coming into the summer, and then the Krug news that they're going to be without him now. And it's like, it makes sense that they want to add a good young defenseman into their prospect pool, which again goes back to, it's puzzling why Dylan Holloway would want to accept this. Like, for Broberg, it's a chance to make, instead of over the next 2 years, $2 or $3 million with the Oilers, he's making $9 million with the St. Louis Blues. For Holloway, it's like, okay, you're making an extra $2 million. Again, I said this earlier, not insignificant, but you're passing up on a great opportunity to play in Edmonton, and it feels like you're a bit of a pawn in this whole situation. And maybe even Dylan Holloway knew he was a pawn, and his agent said, hey, the Oilers are going to match this thing for you. You're going to get your money. You're going to get to stay in Edmonton. Like, just go along with the plan here and do a solid for your boy Philip. But again, the Holloway thing's puzzling, because this does feel like St. Louis is making a hard pitch or a hard move to get Broberg, and Holloway's just kind of sitting there like a pawn on the chessboard.
It's funny. I mean, obviously, we in Vancouver keep pretty close tabs on the Oilers, saw them in the playoffs, watched them go to the Stanley Cup final. I guess I knew this, but it sort of was driven home again yesterday. I was looking at their roster and their depth chart. And I expect that they'll retain one of these two. But if they were both to go, like Connor McDavid would be left as one of the youngest players on the Edmonton Oilers. They really and they're in this cup window. Again, I get it, but they don't have an awful lot of young depth and talent. They traded first rounders to get guys like Ekholm. This is not a young hockey club.
Can they afford to lose both is basically it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, this is, again, where the conversation and the debate gets even more complicated. When you look at the pieces on their blue line, it's like, hey, Darnell Nurse isn't getting any younger. You mentioned Ekholm, Kulak, Ceci, like not a lot of youth to go around there. Philip Broberg kind of stands out in that regard. When you look at the forward group, McDavid and Draisaitl, like they'll be productive into their mid-30s, no concerns there. But they did make a move a month and a bit ago to go get Matt Savoy from the Buffalo Sabres in that Ryan McLeod trade. And it's kind of like, okay, now you do have this kind of piece of young talent. Raph Lavoie is another guy. I view him as a tweener. Some people still think he is upside, but you can look at the forward side of things and kind of go like, oh, there's a few interesting young pieces. Now you got Matt Savoy, who was a top 10 pick a couple years ago. Like if the money was even, it makes way more sense to keep Philip Broberg in the mix. Like he was slated to play on their second pairing. Granted, on the right side, they were going to play him on his offside, but he was kind of going to be relied on to be a second pairing defenseman for the Oilers. Dylan Holloway probably slotted on the third line to start. What's easier to replace, a third line left winger or a top four right side defenseman? Well, it's the third line left winger. So again, with the addition of Savoy, with the roles and where these guys were kind of slotted on the depth chart, and the fact that they do need to keep some youth around in some parts of their lineup, it makes way more sense to keep Philip Broberg. But again, the contract and the money and all of that adds another wrinkle into it. And yeah, the fact that they have to give up one of their next 2 first-round picks now because they wanted to trade into the first round this past year, which is fine. You added a prospect into the system, but there is not a lot of youth down in Bakersfield right now. Even when we look at the guys who are on the list of call-ups, it's like Ruby Jarventi, who's a guy they picked up from Ottawa. He's been bouncing around in the AHL for a couple of years. It's Lane Peterson. He's kind of seen as the guy who's like, oh, maybe he surprises us and make the team. And he's, 27, 28 years old. So not a lot of young talent in Edmonton, but I guess that's what comes with being in the window that they've been in the last number of seasons.
Even unsigned draft picks, guys. The highest pedigreed one is 21-year-old Luca Munzenberger, who's a third-round pick in terms of defensemen. So again, boy, you're going to miss Philip Broberg if you don't. Let me ask you this, and this is just going to be pure speculation. Do these 2 offer sheets happen if it's not Bowman as GM, if it's somebody else? Is there an axe to grind here? Is there a sense of, I don't care what this guy thinks of me after all that's gone down? Now, these are 2 tried and true hockey men that have both been around for a long time. I would have guessed without knowing either of them that they know each other and probably have been fond and had been cordial with each other in years gone by. Contemporaries, if you will. But it just seems a little weird. Bowman gets this controversial appointment, and he's the one that gets offer sheeted immediately.
Well, if you want to go, real tinfoil hat conspiracy here, like, okay, Ken Holland, I'm not sure how willing Ken Holland was to walk away at the end of all this. I know there was some back and forth about could there be another role. I think there were points where maybe Holland wanted to stay and he felt like he was getting lowballed. Holland and Doug Armstrong are old buddies. Like they go way back. So was this Ken Holland maybe nudging Doug Armstrong saying, yeah, go do me a solid. Go mess with him a little bit. Also, you know who else is working in the Blues front office right now? It's Peter Chiarelli. So Chiarelli has a connection there. Holland has a connection to Doug Armstrong, and maybe he's not happy about having to leave the organization when he did and feeling like he maybe got pushed out a little bit. And then you have the Bowman-Armstrong connection, Central Division, Blackhawks, Blues. They would have had a history together there and a bit of a rivalry. There's the Canada-USA thing with Bowman and Armstrong as well. So, yeah, like there's no doubt those 2 go back, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do have a little bit of a rivalry. Then you look at the connections Armstrong has to now former Oilers GMs, and it's like, yeah, okay, maybe this was done a little bit maliciously. Like, okay, if we have the assets to do it, they went out of their way to go reacquire their second-round pick to do this. So everything just lined up perfectly, I think, for St. Louis. And Doug Armstrong probably got a couple of text messages from Holland and Chiarelli with a nice little thumbs up saying, way to stick it to him.
Let's just kind of play this experiment out then and say, for the sake of this argument, that Broberg winds up in St. Louis and Evander Kane isn't ready for the start of the season and may not be around for a chunk of the season. How much of a blow are those 2 moves to a hockey club that continues to have Stanley Cup aspirations.
We're asking for a friend here. Yes.
I don't think the Kane one is that much of a blow because throughout the course of the regular season, this Oilers offense is gonna find a way to produce, right? Like you brought in Arvidsson, you brought in Skinner. The only piece you really lost, I guess you do lose Kane, and then you also lost Fogle, but I think Skinner and Arvidsson are upgrades there. So the Kane thing isn't that big of a deal. I actually think it's kind of nice that they'll be able to, hopefully for the Oilers' sake, just bring him into the lineup on night one of the playoffs and have a healthy and hopefully motivated Evander Kane. The Broberg loss it's significant, and it was a gamble going the route they were going anyways, where it's like, okay, let's hope this guy who, again, has played 10 good games of NHL hockey in his career, let's hope he can play the right side, his offside, for an entire season as a top 4 defenseman. Because if he ends up being the one that goes to St. Louis, you're looking at a right side depth chart that is Bouchard, Ceci, Stetcher. Like, that's not exactly good. Cody Ceci kind of stinks. Troy Stetcher is a 6'7" defenseman. One of those guys is going to have to play 20-plus minutes a night for you, and it's kind of like, okay, the blue line, it's going to be a problem. And then I guess you would get the second-round pick for Broberg, and maybe you try to use that in some sort of a trade, but you're in LTIR space. Making deals in season is way more difficult when you're dealing with an LTIR pool. So it's the Broberg loss is significant. Even if it was, like I said, a risk to put him into that spot to begin next season, it's still better than the alternative. And if they're faced with the alternative heading into October, I think it has a chance to make life really difficult on Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard, one guy who's a journeyman and the other guy who has, over the last number of years, as much as he's had his stretches of 2-3 months where he looks like a top 10 goalie, Skinner's had his stretches of 4 to 6 weeks where it's like, whoa, they need to get a better goalie to play with this guy. So I think it could really hurt the Oilers losing Broberg. Granted, it could have been a problem if Broberg stayed too, but regardless, I think keeping pucks out of their net might be a bit of a problem for the Oilers next year.
I'm hearing Stan Bowman is online. One, he'd like to correct you. Cody Ceci is not terrible. He's very good. It would be a great addition to any team in the National Hockey League if they would like to trade for him. Tyler, thanks so much for doing this. Appreciate it. Gives us a good lowdown on what's going on in Edmonton, and we'll see how this plays out over the next few days.
Sounds good. See you, boys.